We're carrying on from the last episode that we did concerning the Qur'an itself. Remember in the last episode we asked the question, if Muslims believe the Bible has been corrupted, then they're going to have to go back to their own Qur'an and they're going to have to look at their Qur'an, and we introduced quite a few verses that tell Muslims to go back to the Bible itself if they have any questions. Chapter 10 verse 94, chapter 21 verse 7, chapter 4 verse 136, chapter 5 verse 46 and 47, and also verse 68. These are verse after verse after verse after verse that tell Muslims to come back to the Bible, to do not argue. That chapter 29 verse 46, don't even argue with the Christians on this, and that we Christians are to use our own Bible as a guide to know how we're to look at the world. And so it's very clear that the Quran gives an awful lot of authority to the Bible. And I've always asked Muslims, so where is this notion that the Bible, the previous scripture, have been corrupted? There are quite a few references that talk about Jews covering and not revealing everything that's in their scriptures. That doesn't mean the scripture is corrupted. That just means that the Jews covered it and did not allow others to read it. But the only one that really I've ever heard Muslims legitimately say there has possibly a corruption is in Surah 2, ayah 79. Chapter 2, verse 79. Let's open it and let's look at it and let's see what it says here. And this is what it says. I'm using Hilali and Khan's translation, the Arabic and the English right next to each other. And in the English it says in verse 79, then woe to those who write the book with their own hands and then say, this is from Allah, to purchase with it a little price. Woe to them for what their hands have written, and woe to them for that they earn. So woe to those who write the book. Who are this referring to? If you look at the preceding verses, this is referring to the Jews. So woe to those Jews who write with the book with their own hands and then say, this is from Allah. On face value, when you first read that, it says, whoa, this looks pretty clear that the Jews have written and have changed the book and written it with their own hands and then call it from Allah. That seems to suggest, if that's the only verse you were to read, if that's the only thing you were to look at, it looks like that. That's why always, Muslims, everybody, Christians and everybody, whenever you read a reference or whenever you read a verse in any holy book, whether it's the Bible or the Qur'an, you always need to look at the context. Look and see who this is writing about, and look and see the verses that come before and after to know the context of this, of the context of what the author is trying to say. And all you need to do is read the verse before. Read verse 78. Read that with verse 79. So let's do that here. Verse 78 in chapter 2 says this, and there are among them, and in parentheses it's saying Jews. So this is referring to the Jews. Amongst them there are the Jews, unlettered people. What does that mean? That means they don't have scriptured. Unlettered. They don't have scripture themselves, who know not the book. That means they don't know the book. That means they don't know the Bible. These are Jews who are unlettered. That could also mean that they just are illiterate, but in most cases it means they just don't have the book. And it says very clearly, who know not the book, but they trust upon false desires, and they but guess. So these are Jews who don't have the scripture. They trust upon their own desires. They but guess. They're guessing. Now put that with verse 79, and let's do them both together. There are amongst them, the Jews, unlettered people, who know not the book, they don't know the Bible, but they trust upon false desires, and they but guess. Then woe to those who write the book. That means they write, there's something called that they're writing with their own hands, and then say, this is from Allah. So these are the Jews who are not using the Bible, they're not going to the Bible, they're but guessing. They're writing with their own hands, and then they're saying, this is from God. What's that referring to? See, most Muslims have no idea the context of that. To understand the context of that, you need to go back to the Jewish, not only to the Jewish traditions, you need to go back to see what the Jews were doing, especially in the 2nd century AD. And you will see that the Jews, especially in the diaspora, were coming across lots of fables, lots of other stories. And they were amalgamating these stories, and they were putting them into what they call the Talmud or the Mishnah. These are the apocryphal traditions. These were never considered by Jews to be authoritative. They were never on a par with the Bible itself. And so these two verses are referring to those traditions, those Jewish traditions, apocryphal writings, and it's telling the reader, telling the Muslims, be careful of these Jews who are writing things outside of the Bible, outside of the book, and they're guessing as they go, and then they're calling it from Allah. So this is nothing more than a warning against apocryphal writings. But I don't want to just stop there. Hold on a minute. Apocryphal writings. Oh, could this be referring to stories that are in the Qur'an itself? Like chapter 5, verse 31 and 32. Surah 5, ayah 31 and 32. The story of Cain and Abel. See, that's an apocryphal account. Cain kills his brother Abel, doesn't know what to do with the body. He then sees a raven scratching the ground, bearing its partner, and he decides to follow the example of the raven. Here is an apocryphal account. We know about this account. It's a story of Cain who kills his brother Abel, doesn't know what to do with the body. He looks and he sees a raven who is scratching the ground and creating a hole to bury his partner, and so he follows the example of that raven. Now that is not in my Bible, so where does that story come from? Well, it comes from a 2nd century apocryphal account written by Jonathan ben Uzziah. That is a very well-known, in fact you can get it in your libraries today. It was written in the 2nd century, that's a good 400 to 500 years before the Quran ever came into being. It was borrowed and incorporated and put into chapter 5 verse 31 and 32. Let's look at another one. How about the story of Abraham, who supposedly is in Mecca? I had no idea Abraham ever went to Mecca, but that's in chapter 21, Surah 21, verses 51 to 71. There is Abraham. He's there. He goes into the Kaaba. He takes a large idol and he smashes all the smaller idols. The next day, the Muslims come and see the smashed idols. They go to Abraham and they blame him for it. And he says, don't talk to me, talk to the larger idol. Where did that story come from? Well, that comes from the Mishnah of Rabbah. The Mishnah of Rabbah, which you can get in your libraries today, is the reference to going in and Abraham destroying the idols. It doesn't say Mecca. There's no reference in Mecca in that account. It just says the idols. And what's fascinating, that story was also written in the 2nd century and then borrowed by those who wrote the Quran and incorporated into the Quran in the 7th and 8th century. How about Solomon and Sheba? There's another story. There's another good one. The story of Solomon and Sheba is in Surah 27, verses 17 to 44, or ayah 17 to 44 out of Surah 27, chapter 27. That's a great story. It's a story that I would love to have heard about in Sunday school if it were true. And yet here you have an apocryphal account of Solomon. He's training up his birds, getting them ready for battle. He notices that one of his birds is missing, the hoopoe bird. Goes, hoopoe, hoopoe, and that's why it's called the hoopoe bird. He gets angry because it's not there. When it finally does fly and land at his feet and talks to him, this hoopoe bird talks about this gorgeous queen that's in the south, and that he has to go down and see her. Well, he doesn't have time to do that, so he asks the hoopoe bird to do that. Go down to Sheba, that's the country this queen is in, and the bird does and talks to the queen of Sheba. She talks to the bird. Amazing. She comes up then with her whole retinue, comes up to Jerusalem where Solomon is sitting in his throne room. And as she comes in the door of the throne room, as she's coming across, she notices that there's a pool, a pond in the middle of the floor, and she picks up her skirts to keep them from getting wet. Now that's an amazing story. I would love to have had that in Sunday school. I missed it. And the reason why I missed it is because this is not in Scripture. It is not in the story of Solomon in the Old Testament. It is from the second Targum of Esther, which is another apocryphal account written in the 2nd century by the Jews who know not Scripture. They but guess. They write with their own hands and say it is from God. That's why they're called apocryphal writings. Yet here you have Jonathan ben Uzziah, you also have the Mishnah of Rabbah, and you have the second Targum of Esther appearing in this book. So when you come to chapter 2, verse 78 and 79 of the Quran, and you read this warning by the Quran to be careful of those Jews who know not the book, they but guess, they write with their own hands and say it's from God, beware of it, the Quran is saying. Oh, hold on a minute. So it's saying beware of chapter 5, verse 31 and 32. Beware of chapter 21, verse 51 to 71. Beware of chapter 27, verse 17 to 44, these are not from God. In fact, if you want to say chapter 2, verse 78 and 79 is a reference to the corruption of Scripture, no, this is a reference to the corruption of the Qur'an. It's a self-indictment. It actually is an own goal. Do not bring that up to me in public, because I will say, yes, exactly. The Quran is warning you of these very stories. It's warning you about these stories that are in your own book. The Quran is basically indicting itself. No, the Bible is not corrupted as Muslims claim. These apocryphal accounts you won't find in the Bible for a very good reason. They were written after the Bible was already canonized and was being used both by the Jews and also the early church, all from the 2nd century on. The one that I talked about Cain and Abel, Jonathan ben Uzziah, it was then incorporated into the Bar Sanhedrin, chapter 4, verse 5, in the 5th century, the late 5th century, and that's why you have verse 32 that talks about the blood. He who takes the blood of one is if he takes the blood of all. He who saves the blood of one is if he saves the blood of all. That was an editorial comment that was incorporated into the story of Cain and Abel that came from Jonathan ben Uzziah. Then it was incorporated into the Bar Sanhedrin, chapter 4, verse 5, in the 5th century, late 5th century, then was borrowed. Both those stories were then borrowed and put into the Quran somewhere in the 7th and 8th century. Ooh, I love it. The more you try to scratch and destroy the Bible, the more you're going to start scratching and destroying the Quran. Coming and going everywhere you go. When you see Muslims who say it's been corrupted, they need to be careful. Don't use chapter 2, verse 78 and 79, because that's going to destroy your Quran. I hope this helps. This has been good to be able to, in the snow, it's snowing again here in the United States. Terrific to be able to unpack this material for you and understand when the Muslims say that the Bible is corrupted, they better not use their Quran, because their Quran is not only going to destroy that notion, it's also going to destroy itself. Great. This is Jay here in the United States. Over and out.